This is HOA backfired. The paint marks on my lawn became her evidence. Karen walked up with a clipboard and shouted that she was documenting my property line like it was a crime scene. "You are going to pay the maximum fine," she said, jabbing her finger at the fence panel leaning against the post in my yard. I am standing there with a bag of screws in my pocket and a contractor waiting on my driveway, and this woman is treating my fence like I just committed a felony. I work rotating shifts as a firefighter in St. Paul, Minnesota, and I had taken a rare weekday off to supervise the install. The Heritage Oaks HOA board had been quiet for months, and I thought I was in the clear. I was wrong. Rebecca Harris is the Safety Committee Chair, and she uses that title like a weapon. She has blonde hair pulled into a sleek low ponytail, and she is wearing a white blazer with the hood up even though it is a cool evening with no rain. In one hand, she has a clipboard. In the other, she has a roll of caution tape, and she yanks it out dramatically like she is about to seal off a biohazard. "This fence is a clear violation of the setback rules," she said. "The rules do not care about your excuses, and neither do I." I took a breath. The fence is 6 inches inside my property line. I had the survey done 2 weeks ago. The contractor already pulled the permit from the city. Rebecca did not even look at me. She turned to the contractor and said, "We can tow first and explain later. That is how enforcement works." The contractor, a guy named Luis who had been doing fence work in this neighborhood for 10 years, gave me a look that said he had seen this before. He pulled out his phone and stepped back toward his truck. Rebecca walked along the fence line with her clipboard, taking photos of every post. She was not measuring anything. She was performing. A woman walking her dog slowed down across the street, filming from a safe distance. Rebecca did not notice or did not care. "I need to see your permit," Rebecca said. I pulled the folded packet from my back pocket and held it out. She did not take it. She looked at it like it was contaminated. "That does not matter," she said. "The HOA covenants override city permits. You are blocking my view of your yard, and that is a safety concern." I did not stop her because I wanted her on record. I had my phone in my shirt pocket recording audio. Luis was filming video from his truck. The dog walker was still there. I knew if Rebecca kept talking, she would say something I could use later. Rebecca pulled a pre-printed notice from her clipboard and slapped it against the fence post. It had the Heritage Oaks HOA board letterhead at the top with no readable details, just a block of text and a signature line. She signed it with a pen she pulled from her blazer pocket, then turned and walked toward me. "You have 72 hours to remove this fence or you will be fined $500 per day," she said. "If you continue after that, we will pursue a lien on your property." Luis walked back over. He looked at the notice, then at me. "You want me to keep going?" he asked. I nodded. "Finish the posts today. We will deal with this." Rebecca turned on him. "If you proceed, you are working on an unapproved structure and you could be cited by the HOA for trespassing." Luis laughed. "Lady, I have been cited by HOAs before. It does not stick. I have a contract and a permit. You want to sue me? Go ahead." Rebecca went red. She pointed at me and said, "You are going to regret this. The rules do not care about your excuses, and neither do I." She walked back to her car, got in, and drove off. The caution tape was still sitting on the ground next to the first post. Luis picked it up and tossed it in his truck bed. "You good?" he asked. I nodded. "I have been gathering proof for weeks. Let her escalate. I am ready." That night, I sat at my kitchen table and opened the tabbed binder I had been building since the conflict started. I run a home-based consulting business on the side, freelance safety training for construction crews. My business license is registered with the city, and Rebecca had been trying to get it revoked for months. She claimed that home-based businesses violated the covenants, even though the covenants explicitly allow them as long as there is no storefront or heavy traffic. I had the covenant language printed and highlighted in the binder. The fence was just the latest excuse. Rebecca lives 2 houses down, and she has been obsessed with my yard since I moved in. The truth is, the fence blocks her view of my driveway, and she used to walk through my yard as a shortcut to the neighborhood entrance. I had asked her to stop. She ignored me. So I put up a fence. The survey I had done 2 weeks earlier showed the fence line was 6 inches inside my property on all sides. The city permit was clean, the contractor was licensed and insured. But Rebecca did not care about facts. She cared about control. I pulled out my phone and checked the audio recording from that evening. Rebecca's voice came through clearly. "We can tow first and explain later. That is how enforcement works." I saved the file and labeled it. The next morning, I got an email from the Heritage Oaks HOA Management Company. It was not from Rebecca, it was from the board president, a retired accountant named Gerald, who usually stayed out of enforcement drama. The subject line said, "Immediate compliance required." The email stated that my fence installation had been flagged by the Safety Committee as a violation of Covenant Section 4.7, which governed exterior alterations. It said I had not submitted an architectural review form before starting work. It said the fence exceeded the maximum allowable height by 4 inches and violated the setback requirement by encroaching on a utility easement. None of that was true. I replied immediately. I attached the survey, the city permit, the covenant section that explicitly allowed fences up to 6 feet, and a photo of the pre-install notification I had mailed to the HOA office 3 weeks earlier. I kept the tone calm and factual. I ended with a request for a formal hearing if the board still believed I was in violation. Gerald replied 2 hours later. The email was 1 sentence. "The Safety Committee will follow up." That afternoon, Rebecca showed up again. This time, she brought a man in a reflective vest and a hard hat. He was carrying a clipboard and a tape measure. Rebecca introduced him as an HOA-approved contractor brought in to verify compliance. I stepped outside. I did not invite them onto my property. I stood on the front step and said, "Do you have a work order from the city?" Rebecca smiled. "We do not need one. This is an HOA matter." The man in the vest looked uncomfortable. He was older, maybe in his 60s, and he kept glancing at Rebecca like he was waiting for permission to speak. I recognized the tactic. Rebecca had hired someone to create the appearance of authority, but he had no actual power. "I am not letting you on my property without a city work order or a court order," I said. "If you cross that line, I will call the police for trespassing." Rebecca pulled out her phone and took a photo of me. She said, "Documented. You are refusing a lawful inspection." "It is not lawful," I said. "You are not a city official, and this is not a code enforcement action. You are a volunteer on an HOA committee, and you do not have the authority to enter private property without consent." The man in the vest finally spoke. He said, "Ma'am, if he does not consent, I cannot go on his property." That is the rule. Rebecca turned on him. She said, "I hired you to do a job. Do it." He shook his head. He said, "I will measure from the street and the sidewalk. That is all I can do." Rebecca looked furious, but she did not argue. The man walked to the sidewalk and pulled out his tape measure. He measured the distance from the curb to the fence line. He wrote something on his clipboard. He measured the fence height from the ground. He wrote again. Then he walked back to Rebecca and said, "It is compliant." Rebecca grabbed the clipboard and looked at the numbers. She said, "That cannot be right." He said, "Ma'am, the fence is 74 inches tall and it is set back 18 inches from the property line. The city allows 72 inches, but the HOA covenant allows 72 inches or less for front yards and up to 6 feet for side and rear yards. This is a side yard. It is compliant." Rebecca took the clipboard from him and flipped through the pages. She said, "I will have this reviewed by the board attorney." The man shrugged and walked back to his truck. Rebecca stood there for another minute, staring at the fence. Then she walked back to her car and left. That night, I got a text from my neighbor 2 doors down. Her name is Angela, and she is the only person on the block who had been willing to stand up to Rebecca in the past. The text said, "Check the neighborhood group chat." Rebecca is at it again. I opened the chat and scrolled. Rebecca had posted a long message with photos of my fence. The post said I had installed an unapproved structure, refused a lawful inspection, and threatened an HOA contractor. It said I was creating a safety hazard and a liability for the entire neighborhood. It said the board was considering emergency action to remove the fence. Angela replied in the chat. She said, "That is not true. I saw the whole thing. He has a permit and a survey." Rebecca is lying. Rebecca replied immediately. She said, "You were not there." Angela said, "Yes, I was. I was walking my dog. I have video." The chat went silent for a few minutes. Then Rebecca sent a private message to Angela. I know because Angela forwarded it to me. The message said, "If you continue to interfere, I will make sure you are the next one under review." Angela replied, "Try it." The next morning, I got another email from the HOA management company. This one was different. It was from someone named Lisa, the office manager. The email said the board had received my response and they were scheduling a hearing for the following week. It said I could bring documentation and witnesses. It said the hearing would be closed unless I requested it be open to homeowners. I replied and requested an open hearing. I wanted witnesses. I wanted the record to be public. Lisa replied and confirmed. She said the hearing would be held at the community clubhouse on Thursday at 7 in the evening. She said I would have 15 minutes to present my case. I spent the next 5 days organizing my evidence. I printed the survey and highlighted the property lines. I printed the city permit and the covenant sections. I printed the email chain with Rebecca. I printed the timestamps from my phone showing the audio recording. I printed Angela's text and the screenshots from the neighborhood chat. I printed a copy of the state law governing HOA authority and utility easements. I put everything into the tabbed binder with labels on each section. On Wednesday, the day before the hearing, Rebecca showed up at my door again. This time she brought a packet of papers. She said, "This is your formal notice of records request denial. You filed a request for HOA financial records last month, and the board has determined that your request is overly broad and burdensome. If you want copies, you will need to pay a fee of $300 and wait 30 days. I took the packet. I had filed the request because I suspected the HOA was misusing dues to pay for Rebecca's personal enforcement crusade. The denial was retaliation, and it was illegal under Minnesota law. I said, "The law says you have 10 business days and you can only charge reasonable copy fees. $300 is not reasonable." Rebecca said, "The board attorney disagrees." I said, "Then I will file a complaint with the state." Rebecca smiled. She said, "Good luck with that. The rules do not care about your excuses, and neither do I." She left. I immediately called a friend who is a real estate attorney. I explained the situation. He said Rebecca was wrong and the board was exposing itself to liability. He said he could not represent me at the hearing because he was not licensed in HOA disputes, but he could send me the relevant statute citations. He did. I printed them and added them to the binder. Thursday evening, I drove to the clubhouse. The parking lot was full. Angela met me outside. She said, "Half the neighborhood is here. Rebecca has been telling people you are tearing down property values." I walked inside. The meeting room was set up with a long table at the front for the board and rows of folding chairs for homeowners. Rebecca was already sitting at the front table next to Gerald and two other board members I barely recognized. She was wearing her white blazer and the reflective vest over it. The vest looked ridiculous, but I realized it was her signature move. She wore it to every enforcement action like she was running a job site. I sat in the front row. Angela sat next to me. A few other neighbors I recognized sat nearby. One of them was an older man named Ron, who had brought the actual printed covenants in a black binder. He nodded at me and held it up. Gerald called the meeting to order. He said, "We are here to discuss the fence installation at 428 Oak Terrace. The homeowner has been given the opportunity to present his case." Rebecca interrupted. She said, "Before we start, I want to read into the record that the homeowner has been hostile, uncooperative, and threatening toward HOA personnel." Gerald frowned. He said, "Rebecca, let him speak first." I stood and walked to the front. I set the binder on the table and opened it. I said, "I installed a fence on my property after obtaining a city permit and a professional survey. The fence is compliant with city code and HOA covenants. Here is the survey." I slid the survey across the table. Gerald picked it up and looked at it. Rebecca did not touch it. I said, "The fence is 6 inches inside my property line on all sides. It is 74 inches tall, which is within the 6-foot maximum for side and rear yards under Covenant Section 4.7. I submitted the architectural review notification 3 weeks before I started work. Here is the certified mail receipt." I slid the receipt across the table. Gerald looked at it. Rebecca said, "That notification was insufficient. You did not include detailed plans." I said, "The covenant does not require detailed plans for fences under 6 feet. It requires a written description and a site map." I included both. I pulled out the notification I had sent and held it up. Gerald asked to see it. I handed it to him. He read it and nodded. Rebecca said, "The fence blocks the view and creates a safety hazard." I said, "The covenant does not regulate views. It regulates height, materials, and setback. My fence meets all three." Rebecca said, "You refused a lawful inspection." I said, "I refused entry to a private contractor you hired without board authorization. Under Minnesota law, an HOA cannot enter private property without consent unless there is an emergency or a court order. There was no emergency." I pulled out the statute citation and slid it across the table. Gerald picked it up. Rebecca said, "You are creating a hostile environment." I said, "I have been documenting threats and false statements from the Safety Committee chair. Here is an audio recording from the day I installed the fence." I pulled out my phone and played the recording. Rebecca's voice came through the small speaker clearly. "We can tow first and explain later. That is how enforcement works." The room went quiet. I looked at Rebecca. She was staring at the table. Ron stood up in the back. He said, "I would like to speak." Gerald nodded. Ron walked to the front and opened his binder. He said, "I have a copy of the original covenants from 1987 and the amended covenants from 2004. Neither version restricts fences inside or rear yards as long as they are under 6 feet and made of approved materials. This fence is wood, which is listed as approved. The Safety Committee has no authority to override the covenants." Rebecca said, "The board attorney reviewed this and determined there is a violation." Ron said, "Then the board attorney is wrong." I am happy to read the covenant language out loud. Gerald said, "That is not necessary. I think we have enough information." Rebecca stood. She said, "If you let this slide, every homeowner in this neighborhood will think they can ignore the rules." Gerald said, "Rebecca, sit down." She did not sit. She said, "I have spent hundreds of hours enforcing compliance. I have documented every violation. I have protected property values. And now you are going to let him get away with this? Angela stood up in the front row. She said, "You have been harassing him for months. You lied about the setback. You lied about the inspection. You posted false information in the neighborhood chat. I have screenshots." Rebecca turned and pointed at Angela. She said, "You are interfering." Angela said, "I am a witness. You threatened me in a private message. I forwarded it to the board. Did you get it, Gerald?" Gerald nodded slowly. He said, "Yes, I got it." Rebecca looked shocked. She said, "That was a private conversation." Angela said, "You used your HOA role to intimidate me. That is not private." Gerald said, "We are going to take a 15-minute recess. Board members, please step into the back room." The board stood and walked into a side office. Rebecca stayed at the table. She was scrolling through her phone. Angela came over and sat next to me. She said, "You did great." I said, "It is not over yet." The 15 minutes stretched to 30. Finally, the board came back. Gerald sat down and said, "The board has reviewed the documentation. The fence is compliant with the covenants and the city code. The violation notice is rescinded." Rebecca stood. She said, "This is a mistake." Gerald said, "Rebecca, the vote was 4-1. You were the only no." She said, "I am filing a formal objection." Gerald said, "You can do that, but the decision stands." Rebecca grabbed her clipboard and walked out. The room was silent for a moment. Then someone in the back started clapping. A few others joined in. Gerald looked uncomfortable. He said, "Meeting adjourned." I walked outside with Angela. She said, "That was wild." I said, "It is not done. She is going to escalate." Angela said, "Let her. You have everything documented." I drove home. My phone was buzzing with texts from neighbors who had been at the meeting. Most of them were supportive. A few were cautious. One said, "Watch your back. Rebecca does not lose quietly." The next morning, I got a call from Luis, the contractor. He said, "I got a letter from the HOA saying I am banned from working in the neighborhood." I said, "What?" He said, "They are claiming I violated HOA policy by working on an unapproved structure. They are threatening to fine any homeowner who hires me in the future." I said, "That is illegal. They cannot ban a licensed contractor." Luis said, "I know, but I do not want the hassle. I am sorry, man. I finished your fence, and I am glad I did, but I cannot come back if you need repairs." I thanked him and hung up. I opened my laptop and started drafting an email to the board. Before I could finish, my phone rang again. It was Angela. She said, "Rebecca just posted in the group chat that she is filing a lawsuit against you for defamation." I said, "For what?" Angela said, "She is claiming you lied at the meeting and damaged her reputation." I opened the group chat. Rebecca had posted a long message claiming I had falsely accused her of harassment, fabricated evidence, and conspired with other homeowners to undermine the board. She said she was consulting with an attorney and considering a civil suit. I did not reply. I saved the screenshots and added them to the binder. That night, I got an email from Lisa at the management company. It said the board had received multiple complaints about Rebecca's conduct, and they were scheduling a special session to review the safety committee structure. It said the session would be closed to homeowners, but I would be notified of the outcome. I replied and asked if I could submit a written statement. Lisa said yes. I spent the weekend drafting the statement. I included every documented incident, every false claim, every threat. I included the audio recording, the email chain, the group chat screenshots, and the contractor ban letter. I included a timeline showing how Rebecca had escalated her harassment after I refused to back down. I kept the tone professional and factual. I ended with a recommendation that the board implement a formal complaint process and remove Rebecca from her role. I submitted the statement on Monday. The special session was scheduled for Wednesday evening. I was not invited to attend. Angela texted me during the meeting and said the parking lot was full again. She said Rebecca had brought her own attorney. The meeting lasted 2 hours. I got a call from Gerald at 9:30. He said the board voted to dissolve the safety committee and create a new compliance process. Rebecca is no longer a committee chair. I said, "What does that mean for enforcement?" Gerald said, "It means all future violations will go through the management company and a neutral review panel. No individual board member can issue fines or notices without a majority vote." I said, "And Rebecca?" Gerald said she is still on the board, but her authority is limited. If she continues to harass homeowners, we will remove her entirely. I thanked him and hung up. I texted Angela. She replied, "It is a start." The next morning, I got an email from Rebecca. It was short. It said, "This is not over." I did not reply. I forwarded the email to Gerald and Lisa. 2 weeks later, I was working in my yard when a truck pulled up. It was a city inspector. He said he had received a complaint about unpermitted work. I showed him the permit and the signed completion certificate from Luis. The inspector looked at the fence, measured a few posts, and said, "Everything looks good." Somebody wasted my time. I said, "Do you know who filed the complaint?" He said, "It was anonymous, but it came through an HOA contact." I thanked him. He left. I texted Angela and told her what happened. She replied, "Rebecca is not done." The following week, I got a notice in the mail from the Heritage Oaks HOA board. It said the board was conducting a neighborhood audit to verify compliance with exterior maintenance standards. It said an inspector would be visiting every property to check for violations including paint condition, roof damage, landscaping issues, and structural alterations. It said homeowners would be notified of their inspection date by email. I called Gerald. He said the audit was Rebecca's idea. She pushed it through before we implemented the new process. I said, "So she is using it as payback?" Gerald said, "Probably. But the audit applies to everyone, so it is hard to argue it is targeted." I said, "Unless she only writes up the people who opposed her." Gerald said, "If that happens, let me know." My inspection was scheduled for the following Thursday. I spent the week making sure everything was clean. I mowed the lawn, trimmed the hedges, touched up the fence stain, and pressure washed the driveway. I was not giving her any excuse. Thursday morning, Rebecca showed up with a clipboard and the reflective vest. She walked around my property without saying a word. She took photos of the fence, the driveway, the front door, and the mailbox. She wrote notes on the clipboard. She spent 20 minutes measuring things with a tape measure. She did not ask me any questions. When she was done, she walked to my front door and handed me a printed form. It listed 3 violations. The first said my mailbox post was 2 inches too far from the curb. The second said my front door trim needed repainting. The third said my driveway had an oil stain that violated the maintenance standards. Each violation carried a $50 fine. I looked at the form. I said, "This is ridiculous." Rebecca said, "The rules do not care about your excuses, and neither do I." She walked back to her car and left. I called Angela. I said, "She wrote me up for an oil stain and mailbox placement." Angela said, "She wrote me up too. She said my trash cans were visible from the street. I keep them in my garage." I said, "How many people did she hit?" Angela said, "Check the group chat." I opened the chat. 5 other homeowners had posted photos of their violation notices. Every single one had been at the board meeting or had spoken up in the group chat against Rebecca. Every single violation was minor and subjective. It was retaliation. I forwarded the screenshots to Gerald and Lisa. I said I was formally requesting a review of the audit process. I said I believed the violations were being issued based on personal grudges rather than actual standards. Lisa replied and said the management company would review all audit violations before fines were processed. She said if any were found to be inconsistent with covenant language, they would be dismissed. Gerald called me that night. He said, "I am sorry. I thought dissolving the committee would stop this." I said, "She is still on the board. She still has access to the audit process." Gerald said, "I know. I am working on it. But I need a majority vote to remove her, and 2 board members are afraid of the backlash." I said, "What backlash?" Gerald said, "Rebecca has friends in the neighborhood. If we remove her, she will make it a political issue. She will say the board is corrupt and we are silencing her." I said, "So you are letting her harass people because it is easier." Gerald said, "I am trying to build a case. I need more documentation." I said, "I have documentation. Angela has documentation. 6 other homeowners have documentation. What more do you need?" Gerald did not answer. The next morning, I got an email from a law firm I did not recognize. The subject line said Notice of Claim. I opened it. The email said Rebecca Harris was filing a formal complaint with the HOA board alleging I had violated multiple covenants, refused lawful inspections, and engaged in harassment and intimidation. It said she was requesting the board pursue a lien on my property and suspend my voting rights pending resolution. I called my real estate attorney friend. I read him the email. He said, "She is trying to bury you in process. She knows the board will not move fast, so she is using the complaint system to tie you up." I said, "Can she do that?" He said, "Technically, any homeowner can file a complaint, but if the complaint is baseless, the board should dismiss it. The problem is, if Rebecca is still on the board, she can slow walk the dismissal and keep the complaint open indefinitely." I said, "So what do I do?" He said, "You file a counter-complaint. You document everything she has done and you ask the board to remove her for abuse of authority. You make it so expensive and risky for the board to keep her that they have no choice but to act." I said, "I already submitted a statement." He said, "Then submit another one. Make it formal. Include witness statements, evidence, and a demand for action. If the board does nothing, you file a lawsuit against the HOA and name Rebecca as a co-defendant. You make her a liability." I spent the next 2 days gathering statements from Angela and the other homeowners who had been targeted. I drafted a formal complaint and attached the evidence binder as exhibits. I sent it to the board and the management company by certified mail. 3 days later, I got a call from Lisa. She said, "The board is scheduling a closed hearing to review your complaint and Rebecca's complaint. Both of you will be given a chance to present your case." I said, "When?" She said, "Next Thursday." I said, "I want the hearing to be open." She said, "The board voted to keep it closed because of the sensitive nature of the allegations." I said, "That is convenient for them." Lisa did not respond. I hung up. I texted Angela and told her about the hearing. She replied, "I will be outside the clubhouse. If they try to railroad you, I will knock on the door." Thursday came. I drove to the clubhouse and parked. Angela was already there. So were Ron and 3 other neighbors. They were standing near the entrance. Angela said, "We are here as witnesses, if you need us." I walked inside. The board was seated at the long table. Rebecca was sitting in the front row of chairs, wearing her white blazer and the reflective vest. She had a binder on her lap. Gerald called the meeting to order. He said, "This is a closed hearing to review complaints filed by Rebecca Harris and the homeowner at 428 Oak Terrace. Both parties will have the opportunity to present their case. We will start with Miss Harris." Rebecca stood and walked to the front. She opened her binder and said, "I have documented over 40 violations by this homeowner since he moved into the neighborhood. He has refused inspections, threatened HOA personnel, and engaged in a campaign of harassment designed to undermine my authority. He has recruited other homeowners to spread false information and file retaliatory complaints. He has damaged the integrity of the board and the safety of the community." She pulled out a stack of printed photos and emails. She set them on the table. She said, "This evidence shows a pattern of hostility and non-compliance. I am requesting the board take immediate action to protect the community." Gerald looked at the photos. He said, "These are pictures of his fence and his mailbox. I do not see how this shows hostility." Rebecca said, "He installed the fence to block my view and intimidate me. He refused to cooperate with inspections. He recorded me without my consent." I stood. I said, "Minnesota is a one-party consent state. I am allowed to record conversations I am part of." Rebecca turned and glared at me. She said, "You are manipulating the process." Gerald said, "Miss Harris, sit down. It is his turn." Rebecca sat. I walked to the front and set my binder on the table. I said, "Rebecca Harris has abused her authority as safety committee chair to target me and other homeowners who have opposed her. She has issued false violation notices, threatened contractors, lied about compliance standards, and used her position to retaliate against anyone who challenges her." I opened the binder and pulled out the audio recording transcript. I said, "On the day I installed my fence, she threatened to tow my contractor's truck without cause. Here is the recording." I played the clip. Rebecca's voice filled the room. "We can tow first and explain later. That is how enforcement works." I said, "She also claimed my fence violated setback rules. Here is the survey proving that was false." I slid the survey across the table. I said, "She lied in the neighborhood group chat. She banned my contractor from the neighborhood. She issued retaliatory violation notices during the audit. And when I filed a complaint, she filed a counter-complaint to bury me in process." I pulled out the timeline I had created. I said, "This shows every incident over the past 3 months, every false claim, every threat, every abuse of power. I have witness statements from 6 homeowners. I have email evidence. I have photos and recordings." I slid the timeline across the table. Gerald picked it up and read it. Rebecca stood. She said, "This is defamation. You are lying to the board." I said, "Everything I just said is documented. If you think I am lying, show me where." Rebecca did not respond. Gerald said, "Ms. Harris, do you have any evidence that contradicts his timeline?" Rebecca said, "I do not need to contradict it. My role is to enforce the rules. If homeowners do not like it, that is not my problem." Gerald said, "Your role is to enforce the rules fairly. This timeline suggests you have been targeting specific homeowners." Rebecca said, "That is not true." Ron stood up from the chairs in the back. He said, "I would like to speak." Gerald nodded. Ron walked to the front. He said, "I have lived in this neighborhood for 20 years. I have served on the board. I have read the covenants more times than I can count. What Rebecca is doing is not enforcement, it is harassment. She is using her position to punish people who disagree with her. That is not what the HOA is for." Rebecca said, "You do not have the authority to speak here." Ron said, "I am a homeowner. I have every right to speak." Gerald said, He is correct. Continue, Ron. Ron opened his binder and pulled out a printed page. He said, "This is Covenant Section 9.2. It says any board member who abuses their authority or acts in bad faith can be removed by a majority vote. I am formally requesting the board vote to remove Rebecca Harris." The room went silent. Gerald looked at the other board members. He said, "We will take a vote. But first, I want to hear from the homeowner. Do you have anything else to add?" I said, "Yes. I have one more piece of evidence." I pulled out the email from the HOA attorney. The subject line said, "Warning to board recompliance actions." I had received it 2 weeks earlier after filing a public records request with the management company. The email was dated 3 months ago, before my fence conflict started. It was addressed to Gerald and the entire board. I said, "This email is from your own attorney. It says the safety committee is overstepping its authority and the board needs to stop unauthorized inspections and retaliatory enforcement actions. It says if the board does not act, the HOA could face legal liability." I slid the email across the table. Gerald picked it up. His face went pale. I said, "Rebecca received this email. She ignored it. She continued her enforcement campaign anyway. And the board did nothing to stop her." Gerald set the email down. He said, "I did not know about this." I said, "It was sent to the entire board. It is in the HOA records." Rebecca stood. She said, "That email was confidential." I said, "It is not confidential if it is part of the HOA's official records. I obtained it through a public records request." Rebecca said, "You had no right." I said, "I have every right. Minnesota law allows homeowners to access HOA records. You are the one who tried to block it by charging illegal fees." Rebecca turned to Gerald. She said, "If you vote to remove me, I will sue the board for wrongful termination." Gerald said, "You are not an employee. You are a volunteer. There is no such thing as wrongful termination." Rebecca said, "I will sue anyway." Gerald said, "That is your right. But this board has a responsibility to act in the best interest of the community. We have heard enough." He turned to the other board members. He said, "I am calling for a vote to remove Rebecca Harris from the board for abuse of authority. All in favor?" 3 hands went up immediately. The 4th board member hesitated, then raised their hand. Gerald said, "The motion passes. Rebecca, you are removed from the board effective immediately. You are no longer authorized to issue violation notices, conduct inspections, or represent the HOA in any capacity." Rebecca grabbed her binder and stood. She said, "This is illegal." Gerald said, "It is not. Please leave." Rebecca walked out. The door slammed behind her. The room was quiet. Gerald said, "I apologize. This should have been handled months ago." I said, "What happens now?" Gerald said, "The board will review all violation notices issued during the audit. Any that are inconsistent with the covenants will be dismissed. We will also update the fence policy to include clear setback measurements and void every warning Rebecca issued during her crackdown. And we are implementing a new complaint process to make sure this does not happen again." I said, "What about mediation?" Gerald said, "The board agrees to mediation with a neutral third party if you feel that is necessary." I said, "I want it in writing." Gerald nodded. He said, "Lisa will draft the agreement and send it to you." I thanked him and walked out. Angela was waiting outside. She said, "How did it go?" I said, "She is off the board." Angela smiled. She said, "Good. What did you do?" I said, "I brought a printed evidence packet in a binder and slid copies to the board and the room at once." Angela said, "That is perfect." 2 days later, I got an email from Lisa. It included a formal agreement voiding all fines issued during the audit, a written apology from the board, and a firm no-contact directive prohibiting Rebecca from contacting me or entering my property. It also included a copy of the updated fence policy with clear measurements and definitions. I signed the agreement and sent it back. A week after that, I was working in my yard when Angela stopped by. She said, "You are not going to believe this." I said, "What?" She said, "Rebecca tried to call a special homeowner meeting to overturn the board's decision. She posted about it in the group chat. Nobody showed up." I said, "Seriously?" Angela said, "She was standing in the clubhouse parking lot by herself. Someone filmed it and posted it in the chat. She looked furious." If you are enjoying this story, please hit the like button and subscribe for more HOA drama that proves documentation beats intimidation every time. I said, "What did she do?" Angela said, "She got in her car and left. I have not seen her since." I said, "Do you think she is done?" Angela said, "I think she finally realized she lost. You had proof. She had excuses." I said, "I had to push hard." Angela said, "You had to. Nobody else was going to stand up to her." A few weeks later, I got a letter in the mail from the county clerk's office. It said Rebecca Harris had filed a formal complaint with the county accusing the Heritage Oaks HOA board of violating open meeting laws. The complaint alleged the board had conducted closed hearings without proper notice and had removed her without due process. I called Gerald. He said, "I know. We got the same letter. Our attorney is handling it." I said, "Is this going to drag out?" Gerald said, "Probably. But the attorney says her complaint has no merit. We followed all the procedures. She is just trying to make trouble." I said, "Let me know if you need my records." Gerald said, "I will." The complaint was dismissed 3 months later. The county found no evidence of wrongdoing by the board. Rebecca did not appeal. By then, summer had arrived. My fence was finished and the grass had grown in around the posts. The contractor Luis had recommended a buddy of his to do a final stain touch-up, and the fence looked perfect. I spent a Saturday afternoon in my backyard with Angela and a few other neighbors. We grilled burgers and talked about normal things. Nobody mentioned Rebecca. At one point, Angela said, "You ever regret fighting back?" I said no. If I had backed down, she would have kept going. Not just with me, but with everyone. Angela said, "You are right. A lot of people are glad you did it." I said, "I just wanted to install a fence." Angela laughed. She said, "Yeah, but you ended up changing the whole HOA." I said, "I guess I did." A few months later, I got a text from Gerald. It said the board had voted to update the covenant enforcement policy to require independent review of all major violations before fines were issued. It said the new policy was designed to prevent any single board member from abusing their authority. It said the change was inspired by what happened with Rebecca. I replied and said, "Good. That is what should have happened from the start." Gerald replied, "Agreed. Thanks for pushing us to do the right thing." I saved the text. I added it to the binder with all the other documents. I did not need the binder anymore, but I kept it. It was proof that standing up to bullies works as long as you have evidence and you do not back down. Rebecca never contacted me again. I heard from Angela that she sold her house and moved out of the neighborhood 6 months later. I do not know where she went. I do not care. The fence is still standing. It is still 6 inches inside my property line. It is still compliant with every rule. And every time I look at it, I remember that I did not just win a fight with an HOA. I proved that documentation beats intimidation. that facts beat fear, and that one person with proof can change an entire system. One afternoon, I was out front trimming the hedges when a young couple walked by with a real estate agent. They were looking at the house 3 doors down. The agent pointed at my fence and said something to them. They nodded and smiled. I waved. They waved back. Later that night, I got a text from Angela. She said, "I heard those people are moving in next month." They asked the agent about the HOA. The agent told them it used to be a nightmare, but it is better now. I replied, "Good. That is the truth." Angela said, "You did that." I said, "We did that." Angela said, "Fair enough." I poured myself a drink and sat on the back porch. The sun was setting, and the shadows stretched across the yard. The fence stood clean and solid at the property line. I thought about everything that had happened. The threats, the lies, the retaliation, the hearings, the binder full of evidence. I thought about the moment Rebecca's own words played back in that meeting room and the look on her face when she realized she had lost. I thought about the contractor who refused to tow my truck because I showed him the proof. I thought about Angela and Ron and the other neighbors who stood with me. I thought about Gerald and the board finally doing the right thing. And I thought about the fact that none of it would have mattered if I had not kept records. If I had not saved the emails, recorded the conversations, printed the documents, and organized the binder. If I had not insisted on accountability. That is the lesson. You can fight City Hall, you can fight an HOA, you can fight bullies in positions of power. But you cannot do it with anger alone. You do it with facts. You do it with proof. You do it with patience and persistence and a willingness to outlast the people who think you will give up. Rebecca thought I would back down. She thought she could intimidate me with threats and fines and retaliatory complaints. She thought the board would protect her because it was easier than holding her accountable. She was wrong. I did not stop her because I wanted her on record. I let her talk. I let her escalate. I let her hang herself with her own words. And when the time came, I had everything I needed to prove she was abusing her authority. The best part was not the hearing. It was not the vote to remove her. It was not even the agreement I got in writing with a firm no-contact directive. The best part was the moment she claimed she never came by to threaten the contractor and the doorbell video played. The room went silent. Rebecca turned red. Gerald looked at her and said, "Is there anything else you want to say?" She did not answer. She just sat there while the video kept playing. That was karma. Real, documented, undeniable karma. I finished my drink and went inside. The binder was still on the kitchen counter. I closed it and put it on the shelf next to my work files. I did not need it anymore, but I was glad I had it. It was proof that the system works if you hold people accountable. It was proof that one person with evidence can beat an entire board if they refuse to back down. And it was proof that sometimes the best revenge is just letting someone destroy themselves on the record. I have not had a single HOA issue since Rebecca left. No violation notices, no surprise inspections, no threats. The new enforcement policy works. The board is more careful. The neighborhood is quieter. And my fence is still standing. Thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.